You spend over a decade working on something, you can't stop thinking about it. And every once in a while, I'd be falling asleep, or I'd be doing the dishes, or I'd be out walking, and this little voice would pop up in the back of my head, and it would say, "Hey, I wonder what's happening with Aragon and Saphira." Or, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if this happened in the world?" Or, "What would happen if you did this with the magic?" Now, I have been working on other projects. I wrote a screenplay, which didn't work, and I wrote some short stories, some of which may get published at some point, and I'm happy to announce that I am a week and a half from finishing a massive science fiction novel full of spaceships, lasers, aliens, explosions, and tentacles. In fact, when I get home, I'm going to sleep for 3 days, because tomorrow is my last day of touring, and I have been touring for 5 weeks. Yeah. Tired does not even begin to convey it. I am running on pastries and coffee right now. So when I go home, I will sleep for 3 days. I am then going to finish the science fiction novel, and if I like what I read, I will give it to my agent, and if he likes what he reads, there's a very good chance that you're going to get another book from me within a year, if not less. So, yeah, very excited. Thank you. But as I've been working on all this, I've still been getting these ideas for stories set within the world of Aragon. And I've always intended to return to this world. However, I intended to return with a full-size novel, and I've been calling this novel online, I've been calling it Book 5. And you have to imagine that in all capital letters, Book 5. But not all of the ideas that I've been getting have been suitable for a full-size novel. And of course, Book 5 is going to take a long time to write. So I finally decided to try to write some of these shorter ideas and to challenge myself and see if I could write a complete story with a beginning, a middle, and an end in less than 10 years and less than 5,000 pages. The actual inspiration for the first story, which is actually the last story in the book, but it's the first one I wrote, came when my sister and I were watching a big Hollywood movie, and it wasn't very good. And no, it wasn't Aragon. I mean, it couldn't be. They never made it into a movie, right? I joke. Sort of. So, we watched this movie, and it wasn't very good. And I don't know about you, but personally, I find watching movies or reading books that are flawed to be much more inspiring than books or movies that are perfect. You know, a perfect story is like this polished gem that hangs in front of you, and it's beautiful to look at, but there's nothing to get your fingers in. You know, there's no way to figure out how it was made or how to improve it because it's perfect. But something that's flawed, something that's imperfect, you know why it doesn't work. Your brain says, "Hey, that doesn't work, that's not right." And then you often get ideas for what you could do instead, how to develop that story. And that's the way it works with me. So in this case, we watched this movie, and it gave me an idea to write a story about something I had never written a story about before. And that was a dragon. But not a friendly dragon. A dragon like a dragon from mythology, a very big, hungry, angry dragon. A dragon like a force of nature. Which, by the way, is why I am glad that dragons don't actually exist. Because compared with them, humans are small and crunchy and good with ketchup. So I wrote the story. And I liked how it turned out. But it wasn't long enough to publish on its own. And then, about a year and a half ago, someone tweeted me on Twitter. I love Twitter. It's easy to interact with people. And someone tweeted me at 1 in the morning, and for all I know, it was one of you guys, so I'm going to blame this on you. Someone tweeted me and said, "Hey Christopher, what's Murtagh doing these days?" And I don't know, I had too much coffee or something. I couldn't help it. I wrote back and I said, "Murtagh? He's busy fighting off a group of enemies with a magic fork named Mr. Stabby." And for some reason, that just stuck in my head, and I couldn't stop thinking about a magic fork named Mr. Stabby, and I started wondering if I could write a serious story about a magic fork named Mr. Stabby. Whether or not I succeeded, I leave up to you to decide. And when I finished that, my sister, Angela, came to me, and she said that she had an idea for a story from the point of view of the character that I based off of her, Angela the herbalist. Fortunately for me, my sister has a good sense of humor about me making fun of her in the books, or else I wouldn't be sitting here right now. So I said, yeah, go write it. I did not even ask what the idea was for the story. That's how much I trust my sister. We have always been collaborators, we always work together behind the scenes, and she's a really good writer all on her own. So she brought me the story, and I said, wow, awesome. You know, we made a few tweaks to make it fit into the world a little better, but she nailed it. And then that was the point when we realized we had a book-like object. And I then wrote the material with Aragon and Saphira that ties it all together. And when I wrote that material with Aragon and Saphira, it was like returning home after a long journey. You know, I just got this tingle down my spine. And I remember about 3 pages into the book, I pushed myself back from my desk and stared at my computer and said, why did I wait so long? Well, I can tell you I have no intention of waiting so long again. As you may have noticed, it says Book 1 on this short story collection. There are going to be more books of short stories, and of course, Book 5. And more books, too. So yeah, that's kind of where this book came from. And there's something I want to do for you guys now. And it's something I wanted to do from the moment that Aragon was first published, but it only became possible when the fourth book was released, and now, of course, The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm. I want to do a reading for you. You guys interested in that? Yeah. But this is a different kind of reading. Now, the problem with readings, if you've ever been to authors' events before, is that readings are often boring, right? And I don't want to bore you. But what I'm going to do is a very short reading from each of the 4 books, and then a slightly longer one from The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm. Now, normally, you're excited about this. Awesome. I'm excited about this. Now, here's the thing. Do any of you have English copies of the books? A few. Okay. I can do this from memory, by the way. I just want you to know. I can do this from memory. But it's more fun if I have a book. So can anyone get me a copy of Aragon in English? And if you can prepare eldest, that'll be awesome. Thank you so much. So, now, I promised you I don't want to bore you, right? So, I'm going to read you the very first sentence of the very first paragraph of the very first chapter of the very first book of the Inheritance Cycle. Here goes. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. Ta-da! Thank you. See, we're moving right along. Who's got eldest? Anyone has the second book in English? No? No, I need the second book. If you have the second book, yep, bring it up. Or you can throw it like a football. Thank you. Ooh, that's a nice copy. Okay. So as you guys probably know, I invented a number of imaginary languages for the series. Now, I'm no linguist, but I enjoyed doing this. And the main language, of course, is the ancient language, which is the language of the elves, the language of magic. Now, I based this language partly off of Old Norse, which is like Icelandic, and I thought gave the language a nice sound and feel. So I'm going to read you this elvish blessing that Aragon receives in the second book. However, I have to apologize to you guys, because I have an absolutely horrendous elvish accent. And that's not because I'm not an elf, it's because in the ancient language, you are supposed to roll your R's on the tip of your tongue the way you would in Spanish or Italian or, I assume, Portuguese. And I can't do that. In fact, the only way I can roll my R's is by wiggling my uvula. That's the thing in the back of your throat. So I'm going to wiggle my uvula at you guys, and I hope you enjoy it too. Atrasterni onovelduen, verander liefde uninherte onder, undu everinia onovarda. Thank you. Of course, the other main language I invented is the dwarf language. And unlike the ancient language, I invented this one from scratch. And I just love this language. It's a very rich, meaty language. You can just sink your teeth into it. And unlike the ancient language, I have an excellent Dwarvish accent. And that's because in Dwarvish, you are supposed to roll your R's by wiggling your uvula. So I have a chunk of Dwarvish here. This is a dwarf who is angry that Aragon and Saphira are in the mountains where the dwarves live. And he is complaining. So I'm going to read this to you and do a little bit more of the wiggling of the uvula. Born Hrathgarach, born Jürgen Carmeter, nos etagoroth bastarnog, dur incesti rakithen, doch is war of Aj Barzuligor, dur durgrenst Aj Schwelden rak anuin, bo dorak Jürgenbren. You may fetch your book whenever you get the chance. As you might imagine, dwarves are usually rather hoarse, and no one much likes listening to their love poems. Does anyone have a copy of the third book? Here, pass it up. Everyone pass up the book for him. Wonderful. Actually, I've always said that if I could go into my world, I would be a dwarf. I would go live with the dwarves. Partly because, as you can see, I'm looking like a dwarf myself these days. And actually, I have a theory that if you write fantasy long enough, you spontaneously grow a beard. And I go to all sorts of conventions, and I've said this theory to some other authors, and they've all agreed with me, including the women. So, if you're a woman who wants to write fantasy, watch out. Okay, book 3, Brissinger. This is a very large book. And like most large books, it has a lot of sentences in it. And some sentences are better than others, and I'm, more fond of some than others. There's one that involves a bumbleating bumblebee that I probably should have cut, but I was just too fond of it. But out of the many, many sentences that make up this book, there we go. Out of the many, many sentences, there's one in particular that is my absolute favorite sentence. And it's my favorite sentence because I think it's just really well written. I think it has a lot of literary merit. I think it sounds beautiful. And I feel that when I wrote this sentence, I leveled up as an author. So do you want to hear my absolutely favorite sentence from Brissinger?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, here goes. Die, puny human! Because what's the point of writing epic fantasy if you can't write lines like, die, puny human, every once in 1,000 pages? No point whatsoever. If you can pass that back to the owner, thank you. And who has a copy of Inheritance, the last book? No? No? You do! Pass it up! Wonderful. All right. Boy, if I read this whole book, we'd be here for a while. All right. So, I'm going to read you the very first sentence of the very first paragraph of the very first chapter of the very last book of the Inheritance Cycle. Here goes. The dragon Saphira roared, and the soldiers before her quailed. Ta-da! Thank you. Of course, whenever I read that in English, I always imagine that the soldiers are turning into quails, the birds, but that's just me. Now, I have the next reading in English here, but if anyone has an English copy of the newest book, you do. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's the British copy. This is the British edition of the book. So, let me see if I can find the page I need. And there we go. All right, perfect. Now, I promised you short readings. This one is longer. However, the pages are small. So I'm going to read you a page and a half. This is from chapter 8. This is from the third story. In English, it is called The Worm of Colcaris. Now, the reason I use the word worm is in English, it comes from Anglo-Saxon mythology, and there's a very old word for dragon, which is spelled W-Y-R-M, and it said wyrm, or virm, but it means worm, and it's an old term for a dragon. So this is the Worm of Colcaris. I also have to explain this is a story about Urgles, the creatures called the Urgles, and they have a name for themselves. They call themselves the Urgrolgra, which is a horrible word to say. And I wrote it that way just to give the guy who reads my audiobooks some difficulty. And I'm told when he saw that word on the page, there was cursing involved. But that word has a translation, and it translates as the horned, because Urgles have horns on their heads, and they call themselves the Horned. So when you hear me mention the Horned, that's what I'm saying. If anyone wants to follow along in English, this is page 147. Don't feel compelled to. I'm going to give a dramatic reading. Oh, by the way, last note. If you didn't know, I did all of the interior art for this book also. The map and the 3 drawings inside the book also. And that was a lot of fun. Okay. Reading time. The day the dragon arrived was a day of death. He came from the north, a shadow upon the wind. Soft and silent, he swept across the valley, blotting out the sun with his velvet wings. Where he landed, field and forest went up in flame. Drifts of ash choked the streams. Beasts fled, and horned also. And the sounds of grief and terror rent the summer air. The dragon was named Vermund the Grim. He was an old and cruel dragon, canny in the ways of the world. Word of him had come from the north, but never had there been a hint or warning that he had forsaken his lair in those frozen, far-off reaches. And yet, there he was, black as charred bone, with a polished gleam to his fitted scales and a throat packed full of fire. The youngling, Ilgra, watched with her friends from beside the spring-fed pool where they so often swam, high in the foothills along the eastern side of the valley. From that vantage, she saw the dragon ravage their farms with fire and claw and the sweep of his jagged tail. When the warriors of Clan Skagaro attacked with bow and spear and axe, Vermund's flame consumed them, or else he trod upon them, and thus made an end to their ambitions. Even the sharpest blade could not pierce his hide, and the Skagaro had no spellcasters to aid them in battle. As such, they found themselves at the mercy of the dragon, able only to annoy or inconvenience him, but not to stop him. Never that. Like the evil worm he was, Vermund ate every person who came within his reach, male and female, elder and youngling alike. None were spared. Their livestock, too, he ate, corralled them with fences of fire, and feasted upon the helpless animals until his chops were clotted with gore and the ground a crimson shambles. All that and more Ilgra saw. She could do nothing to help, so she stayed by the pool, though to wait hurt as much as any wound. Those of her friends who weren't so wise ran to join the fray, and of their number, many were lost. As the dragon approached the hall of her family, Ilgra bared her teeth in a helpless snarl. Closer it came, and then closer still, and then with a slow-moving swipe, the scaled monster crushed her home. A howl tore from Ilgra's throat, and she sank to her knees and grasped the tips of her horns.